Welcome back to the podcast. We are so glad to have you here today. Thank you for liking, subscribing, and sharing out the podcast so it can grow. Happy to have Kim Miner and Lindsey right with me today. We are going to be talking about this book called The Air We Breathe by Glenn Scrivener. Is that how you say it? And I think he is from Australia. Did I get that right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And it's we're just gonna dive right in without a lot of preliminaries because there's a lot to this, and I think you'll better understand what we're doing if we answer some important questions right off the bat. So, first of all, let's just tackle this title. What does the air we breathe mean in this book? Why is this the title?
His
Totally
his
true.
his argument is that Christianity is the air we breathe. It is, whether we know it or not, whether we recognize it or not. We live in the West, we live in a world dominated by Christian values and Christian principles, and it affects everything that we do. So, but it's not quite so obvious anymore because things have been divorced from those Christian values and principles, and they've been rearranged, and but they're there. It's the air we breathe. We don't even, it's so all encompassing, we don't even see it anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that the idea that we kind of take them for granted, just like breathing, we just like, it just happens. It's just the way it is. We just breathe and we know we have enough oxygen coming into our body, right? And
Mhm.
I think that that's the idea as well. It's like we take these things for granted, not even recognizing where it came from or why or those types of things.
Yeah. Yeah, his opening lines really captured my imagination. The little quote at the top of the introduction says, "An older fish swishes past a couple of small fry. How's the water, boys?" he inquires. Water, they ask. What's water? And then he goes on to talk about how goldfish don't see water. They don't know what water is. It's their environment. It's invisible. It shapes everything they do and everything they see, but they don't even see it. And so he's comparing that to the way in which, like you both were saying, that Christianity is so deeply rooted in everything we say, everything we do, everything we value, the laws that we make, the way we live out our lives, the way we find meaning, all of those things are completely wrapped up in the Christian worldview. And people say that they don't believe in Christ, they don't believe in religion, they don't believe in anything, and yet they live out the Christian ethic every day. And we're going to talk about his arguments for why he thinks that is the case and how we got here. So before we do that, let's loop back one more minute and make sure that we have a quick conversation about what is a value then, because we're going to talk about these values. And in the academies, we talk about values and they're different than virtues. So let's just talk for a second about the difference between a virtue and a value, why that might matter to understand what it is he means by that.
One way that I think about values is that they're personal. Is that the right word? That they're unique
Okay.
in a sense.
Okay.
I mean, there's overarching values, but the way I ordered them in the hierarchy I created in my life, some
Mm-hmm.
is going to be different than the way you order those values.
Mm-hmm.
And we also value different things. Like I think there's some things that everybody values, right? But then individually, we can value different things.
Mm-hmm. So a value is then a concept or idea that we prioritize, that we make decisions by, that we utilize to create purpose in our lives. Values have a huge impact on how we live day to day. And there are lots of things that people can value. There are definitely some things that are better to value than others. You know, you can value cars, but it's probably better to value your children. And they we give them a ranking. It reminds me of Mises' Human Action book, that is a really important primer for understanding principles of economics. And he talks about how every human being creates a scale of values, that's a fundamental principle of human nature and human action, that we each have a scale of values, and that we bring them in, we put them in a certain order, and we live them out every day. And they can shift over time, but he says only that individual can tell you what they actually value and how they're living that out. And what happens to people is they adopt other people's values, or they tell themselves that they value something, but they don't live that out. Their actions actually demonstrate a different value. And so, in order to have greater personal integrity and alignment with yourself, you want to be clear that your actions align with your values. Now, one of the problems that's happening in our society is that the concept of values has become like a free for all. Like, hey, this is a feast. Just walk along the table, pick up your favorite foods, and that's your value system. And it's just as legitimate as any other foods that any other human might have picked up. But that's not actually the case. There are some, in terms of how those values rank in the moral order. So there's a value system, and we're ranking our values, but there's also a correct moral order, which is the argument we're always making on this podcast and in the academies and in the books and all the things. We're always making this argument that there is also a moral order. And the more our values connect and align properly with those layers of true moral, the true moral framework, the more success we're going to have, the happier we're going to be, the more fulfilled our lives are going to be. In other words, we want to ideally try to value most what God values most. That would be a different way of thinking about it, a more religious way of thinking about it. And virtues, of course, are traits of character. So values are the lens through which we're ordering our lives, making decisions, finding purpose and meaning. But the virtues are the way in which we're developing our personal character. And so that's where they're kind of different. In other words, you could say, I value courage, and that means you're trying to be courageous. But if you were to take on that value, you would also be developing your character because you would be trying to live a virtue. So there are some concepts that could technically be called a virtue and a value. And that's where some of the confusion comes in, and we try to clear some of that up in the academies and help people to get clear about their own values. And it does also happen in our friendships, relationships with our spouses, whoever, children, that sometimes our values aren't the same. And so then we have run-ins. And so we want to be clear about that too. So the point in this book, for the purposes of discussing this book, is he's calling these things values. He says that there's 7, right?
Mm-hmm.
7 of them that we've adopted in our culture that are Christian. In other words, the Christian ethic lines them up as part of the moral order, as very high in that moral order, as very or very foundational. You could think about it the other way around. And that his argument is that they originate with Christianity, and we might take a little bit of issue with that sometimes, but that they are Christian in their nature is absolutely true, and that we're living them out every day, and that we actually value them too when we don't necessarily need to. Like, why do we think that freedom and equality and kindness and progress are valuable? Because it's the air we breathe, because we brought it in, because it's part of the ethic around us. Okay, any other thoughts around the background of the book, or just understanding the basic construction of what he's going to dive into before we dive in?
Well, maybe we need just that overview. These are the 7 things.
Yes,
The
go ahead.
values.
Yeah.
Equality,
Mm-hmm.
compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress.
Yes. And here in the introduction, he actually gives us a short definition of each of them. And when we head into them, we'll start that section by just citing what he means by that concept, because we want to be on the same page as him and be discussing what it is he's arguing. Before we head into the first one, then, I do want to say that before he talks about is the first one equality? I think the first one's equality.
Yep.
Before he gets into it, he goes through this cross stuff, talking about the history of the cross, which I thought was super fascinating.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure.
What were some of your takeaways about why do you think he spent so much time talking about the concept of the cross? Why do you think he felt like this needed to be here before he headed into equality? Did you have any opinions about that? Any thoughts?
So it's interesting. So the cross in Roman times, and this is Roman times as at kind of the peak of their decline, right? Is
Mm.
they're using this because there's other golden times of Roman times that are different, but he's talking specifically about this where it starts to decline.
Yeah.
And the cross is a slave's death. It's the worst kind of shame and humiliation. He calls it an unpersoning, right? And what he's showing through that is that because what Jesus does is he comes and he flips all these things on their head. He's the king, and yet he dies a slave's death. He dies the worst, most shameful death possible, right? And that is what changes these things. He's telling us to love our neighbors. It's the upside down kingdom, right? He's flipping everything that we knew on its head. And it starts with the cross, the
Mm.
creator, the Messiah, the what the
Uh-huh.
Savior of the world comes
Uh-huh.
down and dies a slave's death. And that's the root of it.
Why does that change things? Or what does it change? Or both?
I think, well, it gives us greater context because before I read this book, I had no understanding of that, first of all, right? That's actually, I was like, oh, they just must have just crucified lots of people. That's was how it was done, right? Like, and they did crucify lots of people, but to know that it was really the lowest of the low and the worst form of death that could come upon a person
Yeah.
in that culture. And I think it gives greater meaning to the story,
Hmm.
because of who we believe, especially as if you're Christian, about who you believe Christ is. But even if you don't, you still look at this person as a great moral teacher, and understanding that he did these amazing things, whether you believe him the savior or not. And then to actually die that kind of death gives the story that much more power and meaning.
I remember watching a Ben Shapiro clip, and they were basically asking him, well, then what do you think of Jesus? And he was like, well, he was just a rebel. It was just he was citing insurrection, so they needed to put him down.
Hmm.
And so, that perspective of who he was is still very prominent. There's a thing here on this is page 24. It talks about how shameful it is, how humiliating it is to be killed on the cross. It says, to make my point, let me contrast the sacred art of the National Gallery. Because that's one of the things he says is, why do we walk through our greatest artwork? Why do we think it's beautiful art? We're watching this guy gruesomely die in the most shameful way. We're calling it sacred art now. He says, with a much older portrayal of the cross, the earliest surviving depiction of Christ's crucifixion is a piece of graffiti mocking the strange new cult called Christianity. It was found scratched into the plaster of a wall on Rome's Palatine Hill. The graffiti shows a figure on a cross with the body of a man and the head of a donkey. Standing by the cross is a devotee with his hand raised in veneration. The caption says it all. Alexamenos worships his God. So that's how they thought of it at the time, that it was all just absolutely ridiculous. And anyone who would be worshiping someone who had died in that way was absolutely insane. And I think in addition to everything that you've said about it, it struck me as first as very interesting, but then as important to the arguments that he's trying to make, because he wants to bring us in with a different perspective. Like, the first perspective is we call this sacred art and we think it's totally normal that we've got it up in galleries, but it's not normal at all. And the fact that the cross is the emblem that's known around the world better than any other is really kind of weird. And the fact that we would be worshiping someone that died in that way is also very weird. Even, I mean, even people who don't believe he was a god, like Kim was saying, still think he was a great moral teacher and a great guy and very innocent and he shouldn't have been killed and all that kind of stuff. And it's because of this ongoing story and the way that we've told it and what we've come to value. And just like we value equality and freedom and all that stuff, we also value the cross. We also value this sacred art that seems really strange because it's just of somebody being killed in a really terrible way. And so all of these things have come to shape the way that we think and live.
Well, and it bears directly on these 7 values. Equality, that's the first one, right?
Mm-hmm.
The God of heaven came down and died a slave's death. That's it became real. Like that notion is in Christianity, is it goes all the way back to Genesis, in the beginning, right? But once he actually comes to earth and he actually dies, and at the very end of the book, he makes this claim: the resurrection of Jesus, what is the thing that birthed the expansion of all these things that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
When those happen for real, all the things that were just theory become real. So all of these equality, compassion, like, what better symbol of sacrificial love is there than Jesus Christ on the cross? Consent, right? Like, there's this play of the powerful shouldn't exploit the weak, that all of these things, they become in that moment, the moment of his crucifixion, and combined with the moment of his resurrection, is what makes these things real. They've been prophesied for centuries, but now they're real. They've actually happened. It's actually going to affect everything.
Good point. All right, let's head into this first one, equality. This is how he defines it. We believe in the equal moral status of every member of the human family, no matter their rank, race, religion, gender, or sexuality. And from a very simple perspective, or very basic, I guess, perspective, is this just goes back to the book of Genesis in the Old Testament in the Bible. That God said that men were created equal, that he made man, that he made woman, that they were supposed to be helpmeets for each other, that he's no respecter of persons. I mean, that's a theme that goes all through Western canon. He's no respecter of persons. He loves
That they're
loves everybody
created
the
in
same.
his image,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
And because we're created in his image, that's where the equality comes from.
So my question is, on this section on page 47 at the bottom, he says that, as you know, as we do more science, that we actually see more differences in ourselves, and that what we see are differences, what we seek is equality. And it made me think, okay, so what does that even mean then, equality? If we are all so different, what does that actually mean? And we know how he defines it, but like, what does that mean actually in like practice?
I think part of the answer is valuing human life, regardless of how weak or how broken. It's like our dismay at learning that mentally ill people were euthanized, or that they were made infertile, that they're just as human, that they should be just as respected and treated just as well. And it's interesting that you would say that, Kim, and point this out about science telling us that we're different, because science is the new religion, and whatever science comes up with must be right, and it's a bunch of people all putting their heads together, so it can't be wrong. And one of the things that would point you away from equality is the fact that there's really no question anymore. It's kind of been proven that intelligence is one of the greatest determiners of success in life, that the smarter you are, the more likely it is that you'll excel. And you have very little control over your actual IQ, your actual intelligence quotients. Pretty much inbred, pretty much born with them. And yet, as we'll
Mm.
talk about later with compassion and consent and all those things, we're told in the Christian ethic that we're supposed to keep watching out for those people, no matter how dumb they are. We're not supposed to get rid of them just because they're dumb, you know, or less intelligent or whatever, or handicapped or whatever the case may be.
Do you see a connection between our tendency to see differences in with the idea of our individualistic society?
What do you mean?
Just that, is that a tendency in us because we live in such an individualistic society? Like, we all want to be our own person and we all want to stand out in the world, or whatever it is, right? And so we look for differences and we look how I'm different than this person and that makes me unique, or whatever it is, because we actually live in a society that values the individual probably more over the collective.
Yes, but what's interesting about your question is that the individuality that we are chasing in a normal status quo situation would actually lead us to buy deeper and deeper into inequality. That's where that leads,
Mm.
right? Like Kanye West is kind of a loose cannon, and there's lots of things about him that I like, but you know, and I was reading something the other day, and a few years ago he gave this interview and he said really interesting things. Like he'd been converted to Christianity and he was putting out a Christian album, and he had actually asked people working on the album not to have any sexual relations outside of marriage while they were working on the album so that they would be more spiritually pure to work on this album for Jesus. So I'm reading this and I'm like, that's actually really cool. Like that's amazing. And then on the other hand, he's like, yeah, and one of the other things he says in the interview is, I'm the greatest musician that's ever lived. No question.
Of course he said that.
And so it's so undemocratic of him to say. It's so unequal. Like we're super happy to have him be a popular musician, but it rubs us wrong. It grinds. It's like you can't. That's just because you're mentally ill. That's why you said that. You can't really mean that because you wouldn't really actually say that because you know we're all equal. But one of the things that I absolutely loved when I was reading this, especially this chapter, was for so long I have said that I have been so passionate. I've just said this so many times to my husband probably, is that the reason that the evolutionary story doesn't work isn't even necessarily because we can't find some evidence in nature, which we actually can, and most scientists know that that theory is basically dead for macroevolution. But it's also because we don't actually believe it. We don't actually live it out at all. The ethic of evolution is diametrically opposed to the ethic we live out every day. And survival of the fittest is just one example of those. And seeking individuality would be another one of those. Like you're saying, Kim, well, don't we all just want to be really different and really individual? And it's only that we're equal with our equal before our creator. That's the only way we are equal and can be equal, is that he loves us the same. We're all his creations. That's the only thing that actually makes us equal. And
Mm.
the deeper you get into evolution, if you say you believe in evolution, then naturally you should live out its ethic. But then the argument is, oh, no, 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 but we know better than evolution now. We have progressed, right? We have evolved ahead of the thing that created us, which also doesn't make any sense at all. But he makes some of those points here, like the evolutionary story will not lead us to the value of equality. Only the creator story will lead us to the value of equality.
Mm.
And I absolutely loved that because I think he's
It's in,
spot on.
yeah, towards the end of the book, he starts to kind of bring all of these ideas back together. And he says that So he talks about we've taken the Christian story, but we've divorced it. So we want these values, but we've divorced them from God, get rid of God.
Yeah.
And then we've recombined them in different ways. And what he says about equality is that divorced from the Christian story, it becomes a radical individualism.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Take God out of it, and then it is survival of the fittest. Radical individualism is the fruit of that. And you're right, Audrey, we can't get back to the idea of equality without God.
Well, and that was for me, one of the principles that I pulled out for myself as I read this was that the idea that the more I can see the value in others and see where we are the same allows me a greater ability to connect with them and show love to them and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one of the principles I pulled out because I was
That's
thought
awesome.
about that for a while because I do think I, do that with people and kind of pick out, well, oh, you're not like me in this way and you're not like me in this way, and rather than starting at a foundation of where we're actually the same and the things that we do that are, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a principle that you could apply in a myriad of ways
Mm-hmm.
that would just enrich your life in a myriad of ways. I pulled out a principle from this section too. It's page 55. And it just says, in connection with God, we are precious beyond all earthly valuation. It's at the bottom of page
Mm-hmm.
55. That's what makes us valuable, is that we're connected to a God and he is everything and he values us so we can value ourselves and value each other. Years ago, I wrote something at the very front of my Bible, and just recently I went back and it was just on a page before it even started, so I hadn't even looked at it for years and years and years. And I'm not going to quote it exactly, but basically I wrote the question, can we truly know ourselves out of connection with God? Is it even possible for us to have true self-understanding and knowing when we divorce ourselves from the person that created us? That's kind of that same idea.
Mm-hmm.
I think a companion principle is just a little bit above there on page 55. So first principle, we are created by God. We're connected to him. That is where we gain our value. So then a principle that would flow from that has to do with power, or he calls it dominion. And that dominion or power ought to be wielded for the benefit of those without it. So if we're all equal before God, he loves us all, we're all created in his image, then the way we treat each other, right? The dominion that we have, the power that we have, should be wielded for the benefit of those who don't have it.
Yeah, yeah. Which plays out in other values moving forward in the book. And
Yes.
I own Tom Holland's book Dominion, where he makes the argument that we're all, this is just a different title, the air we breathe, that we're all Christians, whether we like it or not. And I actually didn't understand why that was the title of the book until I read this book.
Mm.
And that idea that we're creations of God and he gave us dominion over the earth and we have authority and power because of him, and we ought to use the power the way he uses it. And then, of course, Jesus comes and shows us in the flesh the example of how we ought to use the power that we've been given,
Yeah.
how we ought to relate to God and all of those things at that example.
Yeah, if we think in terms of, rights and duties, that's our duty, is to use the power that we do have to help others,
Yeah. And
to,
this
to
goes in.
maintain that equality.
Yeah. Yeah. And one last thing is just of course, the whole slavery issue, which we could talk about for a long time. But, the Bible begins with the story of liberation. The Bible begins when God says, you are the poorest, worst off people on the planet, like really, like you're slaves, you're beaten, you're taken advantage of, you have no place of your own, no home of your own, no things of your own. And I am not only going to rescue you, but I'm going to ennoble you and call you a peculiar people and make covenant with you and make you special and unique, give you special instructions that will help you stand out and have better, happier, more successful lives, because even the slave is our brother, and he's who we should, and then he does spend a few minutes on slavery was different in the Bible, and here's some ways that it was different, blah 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 blah. But Thomas Sowell, in his book, which I think is the stupidest title ever, but it's called Black Rednecks and White Liberals, and when you read the book you'll know why it's called it that. But he has a chapter on the history of slavery, which is actually very instructive, and he just talks about kind of, it confirms what this author is saying here, that there has been slavery all over, all the time, with everyone. And even we tend to put a microscope on the United States and say that we were the worst devils ever, but it was done. And his point is, we're condemning slavery through the same lens that we had slavery. In other words, you're saying those Christians should have known better. Why? Because they were Christians. Why? Because you believe in the Christian ethic. That's why you're judging them. Yeah. In his book, one of the things Sowell says is that people will say this about America, that it was the only place or it was the worst place. He says, on the contrary, the region of West Africa from which Canute Kint, I don't know how you say that, supposedly came, was one of the great slave trading regions of the continent before, during, and after the white man arrived. It was the Africans who enslaved their fellow Africans, selling some of these slaves to Europeans or to Arabs and keeping others for themselves. Even at the peak of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans retained more slaves for themselves than they sent to the Western Hemisphere. So that's really fascinating to recognize that it is prolific all over. And yeah, shame on Americans, but also shame on humanity, but also what we're trying to do now is actually live out more of the Christian ethic. And it's only the Christian ethic. And I could go into, I actually did a deeper dive on this at one point. And it was the Christians that stopped slavery. Wherever it's been stopped, it was because of the pressure of those who believed in the Christian values that stopped slavery wherever it's been stopped. And it's that driving toward more equality.
Mm-hmm. I wrote, slavery is a universal action, but not a universal truth. And the way we know it's not a truth is through Christianity.
That's a great way to put it. I love that, Lindsey. You could say that about so many things. Theft is a universal action. Adultery is a universal action.
Yeah.
Wielding power wrongly, greed. Just because humans have done it doesn't mean they should have done it. And it doesn't mean that we don't know better.
And that goes with, so one of his main ideas in the book is this idea of the crooked line and the straight line. That there are crooked lines, right? Like we have to own the crooked.
Mm-hmm.
Slavery exists. People have done bad things for bad reasons, or for like with good intentions, but bad things anyways. But his point is, we wouldn't know the line was crooked unless we knew that there was a straight line by which to compare it. And C.S. Lewis says the same type of thing. But that's, we can take slavery. How do we know it's wrong? Because we have a straight line to compare it to. Yeah. Just because people do it doesn't mean it's right. But so here's the straight line. That's how we know.
Mm-hmm. Great point.
Well, and I think that one of the things that he's trying to do in this book, right, is to show that what we're doing is we take this straight line and judge all of humanity and all of history with this straight line when people didn't always understand the straight line, right? Mm-hmm. At the beginning of the book, he said, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, right? and just the idea that because this has become the air that we breathe, we want to judge all of history and think that everybody did everything wrong, because we do insist on a straight line and then judge people that as if their culture didn't influence some of the things they did, or they didn't actually know or understand better in some ways, right? Mm-hmm. And so he does use a lot of history to show how it wasn't this way. Like these people didn't believe. I mean, it's kind of the crux of each chapter is like, look at the history. And there was a lot of societies that actually didn't live in this way. They didn't understand the straight line. They lived the crooked. And then I really appreciate how he will take and like, okay, let's just own that that these people did this or that they lived in a certain way. Does that make it right? No, but right. And then he will.
Yeah. Yeah.
I put that down as a principle. I'm not sure if it is, but this, so principle of discernment,
Mm.
Right. Yeah.
own what's crooked, insist on what's straight.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That is awesome. I love that.
Yeah, that is a good
Awesome.
one.
Um, I listened to a guy who I like a lot, and he puts it a little bit different way. He talks about how that just because we don't measure up to the ideal doesn't mean that we shouldn't have them, that we need a
Mm-hmm.
measuring stick and a standard. And so we should be clear and honest about the ideal, and then we should strive for it. And we shouldn't lower our standards just because we're not measuring up. And I guess one of the things that we will take issue with over time is that I'm not 100% with him in the camp that civilizations before Christ didn't know better and that
Yes.
they didn't understand. One example I give often is Solon, 600 BC. You know, Greece is about to head into civil war. They can't get along. The polarization of the classes is huge. And Solon's the only one that everybody can agree that they is wise and trustworthy, and they put him in power. And if you go read Solon's laws, you'll know that he knew the line.
Mm-hmm.
He made really, really, really strong consequences for rape, for example. And there were other laws in there in terms of how they were supposed to interact with each other and whatnot. And that doesn't mean that everything we think he should have done that he did, and it doesn't mean that he understood all of the things we might hope that he would have or whatever. It doesn't mean there isn't room for progress like C.S. Lewis discusses, but he definitely understood. And you can go back to a lot of ancient cultures and ancient codes of law and definitely find this natural moral law written on the heart sprinkled throughout these civilizations.
Well,
And
do
so
you think,
that's
C.S. Lewis. Go ahead, Kim.
sorry, I was going to say, do you think that that's what he's part of his argument, though, is just the idea that, I mean, he doesn't say it like that. He doesn't say that there were civilizations that lived this straight line, right? But we know that there was. We know that there were civilizations, but like you said, they were kind of sprinkled throughout. It wasn't lived in mass until Christ. I mean, do you think that's kind of what his argument is? Because it's true, if we, we do see civilizations, even if you're looking at scripture in the Old Testament, there were civilizations that lived according to the Christian ethic. And early Rome and some of these places, they lived some of these straight lines, right? But it
Mhm.
was here and there. It wasn't like all of the West like it is now, or what we consider the West lived this thing out all the time.
Yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? Do you
Yeah.
think that's part of what his why he doesn't like go into the because go into the idea that yeah, there were some civilizations that lived some of this stuff.
Yeah. Well, and one of the conversations that we had on Marco Polo before we got on here was just making the distinction that the thing that we're talking a lot about is the law of human nature and its relevance to all cultures at all times and its existence, even in microcosm in these cultures. But he's not trying to prove truth, he's trying to prove Christianity. And so
Yeah.
I personally got the sense that I got the sense from him that he kind of does believe that some of these values didn't even exist at all. And maybe I'm wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I did get that sense, but like for me, I think that there has to be a parsing out. So one of the things that he says that I really like is how there's great men and women in every civilization, and they set an ideal, or they're kind of a guiding light, and following them is really helpful for the culture. But the problem that you have is that as soon as you say, of course, Christ radically changed everything. Of course he did. But if you say, well, but nobody on planet Earth ever even had the thought that slavery was wrong until Jesus came, it can't be true for a lot. That can't be true for a lot of reasons. Even, and I think one of the things that happens when people study history is that they look at what's codified, or they look at what the leadership was doing, and they say, that's what, and I was saying this in one of our Marcos, they say, that's what that culture did. But it isn't what that culture did. There were slave revolts. We know of slave revolts all throughout history. There wouldn't have been slave revolts unless at least the slaves thought they shouldn't be slaves. Whether or not they even believed in God, or believed that God thought that they were worthy, they didn't want to be slaves. They didn't think they should have to be slaves. And so there wasn't agreement. And one of the points I was making was just that if you were to go into the future 200 years from now, and someone is researching American history in 2024, and they're looking at what we're doing and what our laws are, they would think that 300 million people in America, you might be tempted to say, well, 300 million people thought that abortion was a great idea. 300 million people thought that transitioning and being trans whatever person was a great idea. But that's not what we're living. That's not the ethic that's actually present. And so I think one of the things, I think personally, a mistake that he's made is to take history too light. Not even if he does think differently, he should have given a little bit more, in my opinion, head nodding to, okay, but actually people have always known what's right and wrong, and God didn't leave him here to flounder until Jesus showed up, however many thousands of years later. They had a conscience. They had some idea of right and wrong, and maybe some of the cultures didn't live up to that, but some of them were better than others, et cetera, et cetera.
I
I'll give
think
you
one of the
one more
things.
example.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry I'm talking so much, but so I pulled out this Sex and Culture, which is, I haven't read the whole thing by any stretch.
Huge.
But this is J.D. Unwin. It was actually published in 1934. And this is just kind of an example of what the case I'm trying to make here for we have always had an understanding of natural law. So at the beginning, in the preface, this is what he says, and then I'll tell you what the finding was. So I might have to paraphrase it a little bit because I read it to my husband. He's like, I'm not exactly sure what that said. So basically, he's living in the 1920s and 30s, and Freudianism has really set in, and we're starting to have these psychologists, and the therapeutic model is really taking hold. And there's more and more loosening of the sexual boundaries in America, even then. And then, of course, within a decade or two, we've got John Money, and then we've got the sexual revolution and all that stuff. And we'll talk about that more when we get into consent. Okay. A somewhat startling conjecture had been made by the analytical psychologists. So this is where it all began for him. Analytical psychologists are making a claim. And this is what they suggested. This is what they were saying. That if social regulations forbid direct satisfaction of the sexual impulses, this is very Freudian, then the emotional conflict is expressed in another way, and that what we call civilization has always been built up by compulsory sacrifices in the gratification of innate desires. The psychologists arrived at this conclusion after inquiring into the nature and causes of mental disturbances. They made no attempt to fortify it by a reference to cultural data. In other words, there started to be all these psychologists who claimed that sexual repression was bad mentally and emotionally, that it was causing people to be mentally ill, and that civilizations had always been too strict and too hard on people, forcing them to confine themselves within strict sexual boundaries, and it was causing all of this mental illness they were seeing in their offices. And he's like, wow, that's quite a claim to make. I would like to investigate that. So he devoted like all these years to researching this question. He says, I have not tried to prove a thesis, and I don't have any to prove. I have merely conducted an inquiry. And he says, I tried to do this with careful open-mindedness, and I wanted to test this claim that they were making. And he says that I began in all innocence. Had I realized how greatly, as the result of my work, I should have to revise my personal philosophy. So this affected him even on a personal level, at the way he saw the world and what he saw as like right and wrong in his worldview. I might even have hesitated to begin at all. If he knew what it was going to cost him personally, the conclusions that he was going to come to, what he was going to find out in his research, he probably wouldn't have started it at all.
Whoa.
I was so far from desiring to illustrate a personal conviction that I always struggled against arriving at the conclusions which the evidence appeared to force upon me. And I continued to work, resisting every temptation to speak until I was satisfied that I could find no exception to the apparent rules. So guess what the apparent rules are? He
What?
studied 85. Okay, I'll just read the back. He studied 86 civilizations through 5,000 years of history. Any written or physical evidence of any kind, the best evidence he could get, the best original stuff. He found a positive correlation between the cultural achievement of a people and the sexual restraint they observed. They were 100% exactly linked. The evidence is that human societies are free to choose either to display great energy or to enjoy sexual freedom. It appears they cannot do both for more than one generation. The whole of human history does not contain a single instance of a group becoming civilized unless they have been absolutely monogamous. Nor is there any example of a group retaining its culture after it has adopted less rigorous customs. So
Wow.
again, there is, and that is just one. We could go into, I have all this stuff that I put together on, economic principles. I mean, we could talk about lots of principles, not lots of natural laws that and even if we pretended or believed that people didn't know them, you can still see them in action. So clearly people are playing these things out. So anyway, that's a huge tangent. I hope it didn't take us away too much from the content, but that's probably my biggest like breaking point with this author is that I've done enough of my homework to know that there's an ethic that's always been present and that Christ it was an explosion. And I think you're absolutely right, Kim, that it's in the individual human consciousness in a way it never ever has been, that we're living out Christian values in a way that we never have on a global level. But the seeds were always there in every culture. That's what I think.
We believe in natural law is written, like you said lots of times, it's written on our hearts, right? That inherently people know that it's there. And part of that is because it comes from the divine.
Yeah.
And so he's lacking that connection, is really what it comes down to, it feels like to me, because these societies lived out these natural laws and principles to some degree because they're divinely given from God, and we can't ignore them because they're written on our hearts until we start to live in such a way that we've pushed our conscience away enough that we don't live those things, essentially, right?
Yeah.
But he's missing, it feels like to me, he's missing the connection that those things originally came from the divine anyway.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's like the divine came to the earth to live out those natural laws and principles. And because of that, it changed the world because he lived them out. And as Lindsey said earlier, because of the resurrection. So we knew that they were right and good and true.
Mm-hmm.
And so for him, it seems like there's this big gap missing because there's not a recognition of the natural law coming from the divine. And it seems like in the act of the divine living out those things as a person that changed everything.
Mm-hmm. Well said. I think you're right. I love how you said that.
I think illustrates another point that he makes, the power of stories. So he's going to go in and say, our story about the Middle Ages, which we often call the Dark Ages, is wrong. Our story about, right? But he's also susceptible to this blind spot of his,
Mm-hmm.
because this is the story he's telling, that it's all because of Christ. There wasn't anything before that. So for me, this whole book was a practice in discernment because you had to grapple with things. But so I think there's a principle there that in order to discern, we need to be aware of the stories we're telling ourselves personally. We talk about that in the academy, but also the stories that we're telling ourselves societally. Are we telling ourselves a Freudian story? Are we telling ourselves a Darwinian story? What are the stories? And we have to be able to seek for the evidence and
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
question those stories, question those
Yeah.
assumptions.
Well, and that's what Unwin was doing, right? He was like, okay, we've got a brand new cultural story. It's catching on because human beings love stories that eradicate them from responsibility. So this was a great story to tell because it was a permission story.
Yeah.
Hey, you're mentally ill because you're sexually repressed. So it's a great story because it gets me off the hook. And he was a great enough man to be willing to, with a truly honest heart, truly seeking truth, to put in the years of effort to do his homework. And he came out with the truth that was irrefutable, that was across 5,000 years and 86 cultures, irrefutable proof that there is a right way to live, a right way for a society to build itself, a right ethic to have in place, an ideal, like I was talking about this podcast I listened to. And striving for that ideal is better. It's just better. You can not, but it's just better.
And Scrivener gets to that point on the chapter in consent. He calls it the church's marriage and family plan,
Oh, I loved that chapter so much.
where it regulates this dangerous pool. These young men full of self-styled involuntary celibates, high on testosterone and low on responsibility. So this marriage and family plan kind of regulates those impulses. And he says this natural testosterone suppression system actually lowers the aggression of the male population. It civilizes us more. So
Yes.
he
Mm-hmm.
came to the same
Yes.
conclusion. It's
Yeah.
just that he's not going back far enough. He's
Mm-hmm.
he's starting with
Mhm.
Christ, and it
Yeah.
goes so much further back.
Well, the way that he defines consent, we believe that the powerful have no right to force themselves on others, but he actually does spend quite a bit of time talking about the sexual ethic because he's talking about the history of men to use their superior physical power to oppress women, oppress children, all of those kinds of things. But it will always stay with me the way that he put it that that Christ brought men up to the sexual ethic of women, and the sexual
Mm.
revolution brought women down to the ancient sexual uh, expectation of men.
Mm-hmm.
It was one was elevating and one was devaluing, and that was just such a really cool way of thinking and talking about that. I loved it. And in conjunction, kind of with that, with the powerful and the power they wield, looping back just for 1 second on compassion, this idea that, because he quotes Nietzsche from the Antichrist, the book he published right before he went insane. And where he talks about the poison of pity. Pity on the whole thwarts the law of evolution, which is the law of selection. So here's a man, Nietzsche, who's willing to own the ethic. We say we're evolutionists, we say God is dead, then we don't have any pity because we want nature to do her job. We want the weak to fall away so that the strong can triumph. And that's the exact opposite of the ethic, the value system that we're living out now, where we have compassion. I mean, especially Wilberforce and his Clapham group, but even before and after him, making it fashionable to do philanthropy. I mean, there could never, 200 or 300 or 400 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, there could have never been advertisements for charity water and give $10 a month for these poor children that can't even eat in Africa, because pity was not. And again, of course, Solon had pity for women. That's why he made rape like I can't remember if you cut a body part off or you were killed or what it was, but he made very strict rules around it because he didn't want men to exercise superior power. Because again, that ethic was written on his heart, but that it's the cultural norm, very different. That we all buy into it, believe it, live it out, very different. Any other thoughts on consent or compassion?
I like what he says at the end of the book. So equality, divorced from God, divorced from Christianity, leads to radical individualism.
Yes.
Compassion, divorced from Christianity, leads to the power of, he calls it the power of the minority, but he also says competitive victimhood.
Yes. Oh, I love that phrase
Yeah.
so much. Yes. I was like, yes.
And then consent, divorced from Christianity, leads to this power of personal choice above everything else. And he says the
Yeah.
combination of those. So if we've divorced things from the Christian value system or from Christianity, and then we've reordered them. So then if you combine radical individualism with the power of the minority and the power of personal choice, you get the transgender ideology
Mm,
Hmm.
yeah.
and some of
Yep.
the other things that
Yep.
the culture is
Just
dealing with right now.
natural. Yep. It's just a natural outgrowth of that because there's no restraint. Where's the
Well,
moral order that reins you in? There's not one.
what he says specifically is with those three things, this is what the trans activist, it adds up to this. I have an absolute right to self-identify, independent of culture or biology, and as a minority, my choice must be honored.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all you have to do is get online, you know, read comments. No, I'm a bigger victim. No, I'm a bigger victim. No, I have a bigger problem than you. No, my kid is more disobedient. No, my husband is more whatever. No, I'm poor. I'm whatever. And we see some of these. I mean, the founders knew it was going to happen. That's why they wrote Federal, is it 10? Federalist 10 on factions? Like, there were going to be factions. Minorities were going to cry about not getting their way. And so you needed to check on those factions. And when you have this radical individualism, it gets harder and harder to check those factions because there's no ethic that's what's best for everyone. That's not on the radar. And it's just a formula for self-destruct. I mean, it'll just create self-destruction. Okay. And then consent, of course, he gets into a little bit protection of children and seeing children as innocent and needing of protection and that they can't consent, so there shouldn't be any invasion of them and etc. Then enlightenment is we believe in education for all and its power to transform a society. And science, we believe in science, its ability to help us understand the world and improve our lives. So those are kind of similar. Let's talk about those for a minute. What are some thoughts that you have there?
Wasn't it the Enlightenment chapter? I didn't have an idea of the history of the universities and things like that, and how really that was a push of the early church to educate,
Yeah, yeah,
which was really, really interesting.
yeah. It's
I like that part a lot.
yeah,
The history in that one was interesting.
I
yeah.
do
No,
think that we see a difference between, so those first three, equality, compassion, consent, obviously, as we've talked about, elements at least of those have existed anciently, far, far back in many cultures, in many times. But these next four, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress, there does seem to be a definite turn after
yes, yeah.
Christ, that these are
Mm-hmm.
directly related
Mm-hmm.
to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because education is present. They're gathering the Library of Alexandria. There are some upper class women who are educated. The Spartan women owned the property and ran the civilization, like we see sprinkling of that. But education, these four do march forward and just really explode in the last, especially since America was founded. Once we got over here and we got it just really like these took off like crazy. I think I see that.
And this idea of evangelism, right? Because so I'm thinking like the Jewish tradition highly values education,
Yeah.
but they didn't put a lot of effort into spreading it.
Yeah.
Whereas you see with the Christian tradition, now we're trying to persuade people. We're trying to teach people instead of
Yes.
just conquering them and saying, now you have to believe what we believe, which is what they did in ancient times. It's let me convert you, let me teach you, so this spreading of the
Yes.
education we
Yeah.
see with Christianity.
Yeah. And it's that Christian mandate to go out and share it, right? So Christ
Yeah.
says, if you believe me, so then as soon as you're converted, then it's like, you better go share. And then those calls to action, what did he say? Go spread this and obey my commandments and take care of my sheep. And
Yeah.
so that's what, ever since then, you're absolutely right that missions started and have never stopped, and meeting people's physical needs, and then bringing them education and bringing them opportunities and striving to convert them. I mean, it's all through all of Columbus's papers that he was trying to spread Christianity. And he wouldn't
Well, and
mind
that
getting rich in the meantime, but he really did. He really was quite a devout Christian, really wanted to bring the gospel to the East.
Well, and that's one of the things that he talks a lot about in the enlightenment chapter is the idea of spreading the gospel, but how it was often done in practice through conquering and some of those
Yes.
things. And he discusses yeah, that did happen some and it didn't happen some, right? So he looks at those things like, and really kind of owns, like we said earlier, that yeah, there was some bad stuff done in the name of Christianity. What I think is so fascinating though in that chapter, he's talking about Charlemagne and the Spanish Inquisition and all of these kind of points that people use to accuse Christians that they weren't doing their spreading in the right way, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But he says,
What page are you, Kim?
okay, 115.
Mm-hmm.
He says the comparison is stark, but it's worth pressing into. We fought under the banner of the cross, but can we call the Crusades accept a foul contradiction, but now judge them by a different standard? If such battles were fought under the banner of Alexander the Great, or Julius Caesar, or even a Muhammad, what would we call them? In that case, they are unexceptional standard practices, business as usual. If we are outraged by the Crusades, and we should be, that is Christian outrage we're experiencing. So the idea that we're not judging all culture by the same standard.
Yeah.
Right? If we see Alexander the Great doing it, we're like, that's just what he did. Julius Caesar, the same thing. But if someone's doing it in the name of Christianity, right, then all of a sudden it's inherently wrong.
Yeah.
There's
But
a way
it's
you should
this,
do it.
right, there's a way you should do it. And so we do have a little bit of a double standard there in the way that we judge those who we expect to be Christian and those that aren't.
Yeah. Well, holding them to their own standard, right? Holding the crooked line to the straight line, as Lindsey might say.
Yeah.
It reminds me, I liked the little section where he talked about a
Oh,
woman who had been taken
It was somebody
advantage
else.
of. She'd been taken advantage of. She told people for a long time. They had ignored her. And finally, it came to court and she testified. And then it was really cool because it's kind of what you're talking about, Kim, where she's standing inside the Christian ethic, using it and condemning with it at the same time. So saying, you should have known better, what you did was wrong, but also I'm still a Christian, so I'm going to choose to forgive you. And that's what can be done properly if we will be honest and recognize that there is a standard above us, that there is that transcendent moral framework, then we can condemn even ourselves. We can condemn other people. We can hold ourselves and others up against that standard, but we can also use it to be healed, to we can use its principles to move forward, which is kind of like we can condemn our own, we can condemn the Christians for doing this, but also, forgive them, hold ourselves and others to a higher standard at the same time.
Yeah,
well,
we can judge them.
Yeah.
and isn't that one? I feel like that he talks about that in the end, the idea that when you take some of that, you take these values and divorce them, then you're missing a huge chunk in a huge piece of what Christianity is. And it is that forgiveness of ourselves and a forgiveness of others.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to live these values that are Christian, but don't want to live out those other values. And so you miss this huge piece that's so beautiful about the gospel.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Just to touch on before we move on, and probably just shouldn't take too much longer, but in this enlightenment section, he talks about this is page 134. On page 1 of the Bible, we meet an orderly God who's made an orderly world. And that is the seed of science. That there's an orderly God with an orderly world who's made creations who think like him, and that is why the natural world is discoverable. Because someone like Aristotle, science was observational only. So he would just watch and write things down that he observed, and you can learn a lot doing observation. But it wasn't until this really took hold and scientists said, I'm going to do the work, that science really started to take off.
And going back to the motivation for science is to help create more equality, is to help meet people's needs, right? It talks about how, well, we don't believe in slaves anymore, and so now we need to make machines that will do the work of slaves, and we need to, have these technological advances to make humanity better, right? It's a Christian motivation.
Mm-hmm. And I will say, just as a side note, that one of the things that's happened is that we've embraced science in place of religion.
Mm-hmm.
God doesn't get to have the final say, science gets to have the final say. And one of my very favorite arguments about why that's a bad idea was by Houston Smith. We actually study some of his worldview stuff in level 3 of the academy. And I'm just going to read a tiny bit of this, and because I took a lot of notes, but the basic idea is so profound. I had never thought about it before. He says, the truths of science derive from laboratory experiments, controlled experience. But now, watch this, because it's what we overlook. We can only control what is inferior to us. Look at the corollary. Absolutely momentous, but we do not see it. The corollary is that science can only show us aspects of the world, things of the world that are inferior to us, because they're testable and measurable and controllable. It is as if the scientific method or the window of science extends upward only to the bridge of our nose, so that when we look through it, we can only see things beneath us. Just ask yourself, in any science course you've ever taken, in any science book you've ever read, have you ever been told about anything that is superior to human beings? And so then he goes on to explain, if there was something superior, he's like, I know that we study things in science that are obviously bigger than us and powerful than us in physical ways. A storm could destroy us, etc. But they're things that we can control and measure and document. So if there is anything higher than us, science could never tell us about it because it's not conducive to being controlled and measured and codified. He's like, if there are superior beings, science can't tell us anything about them because they think differently than us and they live differently than us and they know way more than us. And so we could never understand them by trying to measure them. He says it's just like if dogs got together and tried to understand math using the skill set that they've been given. So they would kind of sniff around at it. And when they couldn't smell math, they would just decide it didn't exist because that's the skill set that they have for measuring and judging. And so they would just decide there's no such thing as math because they couldn't understand it. Anyway.
Yeah, I think Smith says science can tell us the what, but religion tells us the why.
Yeah.
And so he points out this is another story that we're telling ourselves, that science and religion are
At odds.
opposing forces,
Mm-hmm.
which is not true. He points out many evidences why that is not true.
Mm-hmm.
But also I had this question, can science and religion provide checks and balances for each other?
That's a great,
right? Can we support each other and maybe knock off some of those rough edges? Maybe religion gets too extreme and so science can bring it back, but then science can get too extreme on the other side too, and religion brings it back, provides an ethical framework within which to do science. And so
I
instead
think
of
there's a
being
lot
opposing
to that.
forces,
Mm-hmm.
they work
Especially
together.
if you think of science as an extension of reason, reason and emotion must be checks on each other.
Yeah.
And what just happened when I was reading about sex and culture? Well, that was just scientific historical research that verified what my religion is telling me.
Yeah.
So they definitely can help each other. I love that. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, how, because we have allowed ourselves and our society to really separate them, right? Like, science has essentially become our religion in a lot of ways, and people are going to trust what a scientist says over almost anything else anymore, right? Without realizing all the problems that potentially go along with that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I've had this conversation with my brother, that he believes that science doesn't actually take faith, and that we're all just having faith in different things, but still faith nonetheless, right? So how do we marry the two? Like, how do we help people see that they actually can work in conjunction with each other? I mean, I don't know if we're going to discover any answers right now, but I just think it's interesting because there is this idea that science is concrete always, and there's actually no faith involved in it.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was helpful just for him to point out to me that science, the foundation of it was Christian values and Christian motivations,
Mm,
right? That we're
Yeah.
using, like I said, we're using science to help make people's lives better. It's just that, yeah, we've taken God out of the picture.
One of the things
yeah.
that has to do with that I was reminded of, and I'm not going to probably say it really well, but it's something that I've heard Jordan Peterson say a few times, and I've thought a lot about it, that science can give us facts, but it can't help us order those facts. We
Mm,
need something, we need a value system to decide. And like you just said, or one of you said just a second ago, we use science to make our lives better, but we don't have to. We also use science to make our lives worse, and we could use it to make our lives worse. Why don't we? Where's the ethic? How do we order the information that we find in science?
mm,
What's the check on the scientific findings? Hey, we can obliterate a whole nation with a bomb. What do we do
But
with that
should we?
information? Yeah, should we? What's the purpose? One of the things that Houston Smith says, there's 6 things science can't tell us. It can't tell us values. Science can tell us nothing about what we should value. It can tell us what we do value, but not what we should value. It can't tell us anything about meanings, purposes, qualities, the things that are invisible and immaterial, or things that are superior to us.
like you said, like it denies the idea that we are moral beings,
Yeah.
because it's just giving us facts about something. But like we talked about at the beginning, values define how we operate in the world and give us meaning and purpose. And if we're only saying, well, I'm going to go make decisions based on what scientists tell me I should make decisions on, then we're erasing the fact that we are still moral beings and need to have values and need to have these hierarchies and live in a certain way to give us meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, and they are part of the worldview that we hold. They're wrapped up in the story that we tell ourselves. There's plenty of scientific evidence that comes out that points directly to the creation story,
Yeah.
if you want to find it. But it doesn't always match whatever the narrative is, or it's not publishable, or it doesn't, or it simply just doesn't seem important to the discoverer, or they don't even make the connection because that's not even their frame of reference. So the lens is everything. And we want to make sure we clean it off. This is like Covey's at the beginning of 7 Habits. This is his map, right? Let's try to get our map right. We're not going to get there unless we've got the right map. So keep cleaning up your
Mm-hmm.
map.
I think this is where we see the importance of first principles coming into play too, because
Yeah.
science, the way I understand it, is built on these first principles, like you said, that we live in an organized universe, an ordered universe
Mm-hmm.
that can be knowable, right? That's why we experiment, because it's possible to know, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so if we just take those foundational starting points, it seems to me that brings God back into the picture,
Yeah.
and that's how
Yeah.
I reconcile
Yeah.
the two.
And also an understanding of the scientific process in general. Most of us aren't scientists and we don't understand. And for example, Einstein's special relativity and general relativity, he did not come to those conclusions through experiments. It wasn't a scientific process at all. He was sitting and daydreaming and using his imagination.
Mm.
He was asking himself really powerful questions and imagining what the answers to those would be. And it was built on some scientific knowledge that he had acquired so he could answer the questions better than other people could. But it was done through a very creative, kind of very non-scientific process. So just the way the scientific process is done, how the information is used, the confirmation bias, the lens that people have, what information that they weight heavier than others. I mean, there's selection going on minute by minute through the whole process of anything we do, and science is no different. There's ongoing selection, there's values being put in place, and there's things being prioritized over other things, and there's meanings being placed on them, and stories being built around them. There is, if you really understand the fossil record, what you know is there's actually very, very, very little information. You also would know that radiocarbon dating is very ineffective, especially when there's long time frames. And so you can take the whole story with a huge grain of salt because you know that there's actual very little concrete evidence. In fact, I was watching creation.com the other day on just the fossil part of, and I've read other things, but the fossil record again, talking about how they're almost all marine animals, which actually points more to a flood story than to a long age of the earth. So again, all of those things matter and are part of that story. But let's finish this up. Freedom and progress. What thoughts do we have about those? Why do we believe we're progressing? Why do we believe? He says, freedom, we believe that persons are not property and that each of us should be in control of our own lives. Progress, we believe in moral improvement over time and that we should continue to reform society of its former evils. Whenever I think of progress, I think of Calvin Coolidge because he gave several lectures. The progressives were huge in the early 20th century, and he gave a lot of talks talking about progress and how it was awesome and all of that, but always checking it with a moral framework, always saying, but remember, we have a moral framework. And remember, there are some things that are absolute. But remember, we can't outgrow the truths of nature. So I always think of him when I think of progress.
And like Thomas Sowell reminded us in Conflict of Visions, right? Remember the ancient traditions too. Don't just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And
remember the fence. What's his buckets?
yeah.
Chesterton. Isn't it Chesterton?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Chesterton's fence. That same idea. Great tie back.
I thought it was interesting. So he starts off the chapter on freedom and citing the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. It's self-evident that we have these natural rights. And since then, okay, help me with this. Since then, these natural rights, because we're trying always, modern society is always trying to take God out of the picture, right? So instead of natural rights that come from God, now we have this conversation about human rights.
Right.
And crimes
which is
against
kind of
humanity.
related to progress too. Yeah, it was interesting to see that progression.
Well, and it's interesting because let me just read a little bit what he says about that, right? Because he talks about the difference between after the Second World War, the Declaration on Human Rights versus, for me, I sat there thinking, he's like, it doesn't tell us the why, right? But the Declaration of Independence does. The Declaration of Independence tells us because of the laws of God, right? And so he says, I'm on page 172, the problem with the power to the people is the people, because he's talking about now we've given people all the power because we're talking about human rights, not natural rights that come from God. This is the difficulty for all believers in progress who are not believers in God of justice and mercy above, whether left wing or right wing, whether communist or fascist. If we are only working on the horizontal plane, then belief in progress can become a license to make history in whatever way we choose. Without a pole star above us, we can take matters into our own hands, forging our own path and calling it historical inevitability. I just thought that was really interesting because that's where we are now. We're talking about the idea of human rights versus natural rights and acknowledging the natural law. So we can do whatever we want.
Yeah, great point. So let's take this paragraph that you read and let's practice the 5 types of questions on it really fast, so we can demonstrate how we do this. And for anyone who doesn't know those 5 types of questions or hasn't been in any of the academies, you can go to audreyandlisbacher.com, get the Truth Seeker Starter Kit, and read From Opinions to Principles. My article has these in there and teaches you how to use them. So you just read all this. So the first question would be, what's he talking about? What does he mean by this? So how would we answer that question? Our knowledge question. What's
Yeah, or
going on?
even more
What's the frame of
specifically,
reference?
yeah, what's the horizontal plane? What
Mm-hmm.
does that mean, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Meaning for me that means this the horizontal plane is not including the vertical plane, which
Yes.
would be God,
Yeah.
right?
Yes.
We're only checking ourselves based on what's happening around us, but not based on a higher order, right?
Okay, so then let's follow that with a meaning question. Why does that matter? Why isn't that fine?
Well,
Why
because
can't we
on the
just do that?
horizontal plane, we're left with human beings, and human beings are fallible. First of all,
Mm-hmm.
they're imperfect.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we're not ascribing to a higher power to determine what is right and wrong and what values we should hold over others and stuff, then we're just left to our own devices. And
But if everybody's doing it, why isn't it okay? I mean, if you've got a majority of the people who are going along with it, then why don't we just call that good? I mean, they're smart people, they're going along with it. Why can't this horizontal plane be good enough? I mean, sure,
Well,
they're fallible, whatever, but that many people can't be wrong, right?
well, but I think it goes back to what you were saying earlier, Audrey, about how in history we can look at them and say, oh, these people operated in a certain way because we have a record of that, or because the lawmakers made laws about it,
Yeah.
and think that that's actually what was happening and what people believed in that society. And also the idea, like, if we make laws, then we inherently think, well, those laws must be good.
Yeah.
But if the lawmakers are, because they're human and can make wrong decisions and can think of their own selves and their own gain over others,
Mm-hmm.
then they can be making laws that will inherently be bad for the society. But if we think, well, this must be good because it's a law, inherently that's not true. And then we all have to practice this law that's not actually good or beneficial for our society.
So maybe a principle around this, we could ask, what is a principle? Then we could get to our third type of question. What's a principle here? And while you were talking, I was thinking, so a principle around this idea that the horizontal plane only is dangerous would be something like human beings are prone to selfishness.
Mm.
And so without a vertical plane, without a standard higher than themselves, they're apt to be self-seeking to the detriment of others.
Mm-hmm.
So the horizontal plane doesn't leave any room for knowing if something, I guess, and there's a couple principles in there, but basically, how would you even judge whether or not that leader had done something wrong if there were no vertical plane?
if there wasn't a
Yeah,
standard to judge by.
Yeah,
right.
then it would just be humans doing human stuff. And what's wrong with humans doing human stuff? If we're all just evolved, then we're humans doing human stuff. And this was Stephen Hawking's whole argument. He just took it to the logical conclusion. He just said, look, if this is what it is, if this is evolution, if this is what we're doing, which he really bought into, he's like, it's all just neurons firing. And things are as they should be because evolution's working it out. And then he follows that up immediately with a moral judgment, which he can't make because he just told us he didn't believe in a standard. So there is actually no, which I would love as we finish up to get into the whole judgment thing, which he says at the end, which I think is really fascinating. But let's finish out the 5 types of questions. So the next question would be, and I made a connection to Stephen Hawking, what other interdisciplinary connections can you make? Do you see that principle of when there's not a vertical plane, that it's just everybody doing a free for all? Do you see that in history? Do you see that in your personal lives? Do you see that in scripture? Do you see that in other books that we've read? What are some interdisciplinary connections you can make to see if that principle were true?
I mean, we've already talked about slavery, that it was a universal action, but it's not a universal
Mm.
truth. If everybody accepts it, it's still wrong.
Mm-hmm. And we're judging history by some kind of standard that's not just horizontal, because if it were just horizontal, then it would just be fine.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Or Hitler. Hitler would have been okay doing what he did.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it does say in there that we try to take truth back and end it with Hitler and the Nazis, and to
Mm-hmm.
stop doing that. So for me personally, I'm like, I've got to stop doing that.
Yeah.
We have to take it all the way back to what it is, which is evil. Evil exists.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
But tangent,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, like I was saying earlier, when we were asking the what and why questions, the knowledge and meaning questions, ultimately, what's to stop us from doing whatever? If everybody agrees that we should get rid of Jews, then let's just do it. It's not a right or wrong, it's just consensus. If
Hmm.
everyone agrees that we should go tromp on people to get the Holy Land back, then let's just do that. That's a great idea. We'll just wear our crosses and get on our horses and go kill some people.
Yeah. And we can see that's breaking a lot of um, principal ideas of taking it's allowing us to not take responsibility. It's allowing us to not have compassion. It's allowing
Right.
so that the fruits, like if we look at the
That's
opposite
right.
side, the
That's
broken
right.
principles, we can see a lot of broken principles there.
That's right. That's right. Okay, then our last type of question would be application. So how can we apply this principle of there can't just be a horizontal plane, there must be a vertical plane? What would be an application that you could do in your life around that principle?
I think for me, it's the idea of a core book, like
Mm,
having something to continually check yourself, right?
yeah,
That you measure your own standards and the standards of those
yeah,
in society based on your core book.
yeah, yeah. I'm
Yeah, you
gonna
have to
try
know what
to. Mm-hmm.
the standard is or what the truth is in order to judge by it.
Hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
taking time to
Mm-hmm.
learn that.
Hmm.
A great point. So if we worked it out, we've asked all these questions, we've come to a principle that tells us there's got to be some kind of horizontal measuring stick. There's got to be a transcendent. There's got to be a moral law that's outside of me. Then the next step is I've got to figure out how I'm going to start living it.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's awesome. I loved, and if you have any kind of last words or things that you'd like to say, he draws some good conclusions at the end. But one of the conclusions that he drew was to make sense of where we're at and all of this cultural discomfort that we're feeling. And that is to say, basically, when you wrench the virtues, I mean, the values from the value giver, you wrench the principles and the laws from the lawgiver, and you're left with just the law. And that's what's happening is these values have become so deeply entrenched in our culture and our psyche. We don't know how to even believe or think any differently, pretty much to a person, especially here in the United States. Almost everybody believes in all of these values. But when wrenched from their proper context, like Kim, like you were saying, a core book to check them by, a way to check in, then you just have a law and no lawgiver. And what you have is where C.S. Lewis talked about how this natural law, we find it pressing on us. We know that there are shoulds and should nots. We know that we don't meet our own moral standard. And so what you have is a bunch of judgers judging each other mercilessly. Because
You
it's
want?
God that has the mercy, right? It's not, we often don't show each other we don't actually extend mercy, we extend permission. So we judge and extend permission. So it's like, I'll behave badly and you let me off the hook because I'll let you behave badly. It's like this codependent cultural relationship where we're all just giving each other permission to act badly when we all know better, or we're blaming and judging and shaming each other like mad, and you just might be next. Like you might be the next one that someone else is judging, even though you're just living your life doing your thing. They've wrenched this value out of context to such a degree that it's almost unrecognizable. And they've molded it into something that is not in line with the true value itself. And then they judge you by that unrecognizable standard, which, just causes you to be shocked.
So
Do
I
you
want to
want?
read two parts. Oh, go.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Here,
was
let
going
me
to
read
say,
these
I
two
found
parts.
it. Yeah. 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 I found where she was talking about on page 200, right?
200 is the first one. The Western
Yeah.
experiment has been an attempt to secularize Christianity. So we want the Christian values, but we don't want the lawgiver, the Christian God.
Yeah.
Um,
The rules.
Further
That's what
down, it
we don't
says,
want.
Yeah.
yeah,
We don't want
in
someone else to
order
be in charge. We want to be in charge, dang it.
Mhm.
in order to pursue the kingdom without the king, we have had to dethrone the person of Christ and install abstract values instead. The problem should be obvious. Persons can forgive you, values cannot. Values can only judge you. And then on page 203, he says this: the alternative, biblically speaking, is to live under law. If grace is a flow from above, law is a ladder we must climb. Some are higher, some are lower, and all feel judged. This is the nature of secularized Christianity. Our abstract values are laws, and when laws are the air we breathe, our atmosphere is judgment and it's suffocating. And to me, that right there, so we often talk in
It
the
describes
academy
social
about
media better than
principles,
probably anything I've ever read.
right? Right?
Suffocating.
But this made something so clear to me because we've talked about principles, but and that they're not a value and they're not a virtue. And I've always struggled to understand that this is why a principle is not a value or a virtue, because these values are sometimes relative, sometimes they
Mm-hmm.
change,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so if we take those values that maybe didn't even come from the standard, that came from within our own selves,
Mm-hmm.
and then those become the laws,
Yes.
um, and then we start to think of the laws as principles, that doesn't work, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
it's changing and it's fallible. So
Yeah. Which is why we
Mhm.
work so hard to write actionable principles, because if you take the concept or the value or the ideal of freedom and you wrap it in context, in sentence long principle statements, it is far more difficult to get it wrong. It's far more difficult to beat someone over the head with it because it has context and meaning and common definition around it. But even then, without the lawgiver, it's still hollow.
yeah,
It still can only go so far. It still can only do
yeah.
so much. I loved this principle. We've covered a few of the principles I wrote down, but this one right here in that next paragraph, I love, and I think it applies to so many things. He says, "Be half a Christian, and you will have enough religion to make you miserable." This is a lot like in The Power of Ted, when I talked to David Emerald a few months ago about the power of Ted, and this idea that we need to be creators and we need to hold tension as we do that, but we can't buy in halfway to a compromised vision, to a compromised idea. And so we can't buy in to Christian ideas or to the natural moral law unless we're all in. We can't just say, I've got half of it and it's just enough to make yourself miserable and confused and frustrated. If you don't go all in,
Yeah.
then you're miserable. And I think that's the reason why so many people are all in or all out, more and more so in our culture every day. If they can't
Mhm.
be all in, they're all the way out because half of it makes you miserable.
Mhm.
The truth can't make you free if you're only halfway in.
Yes, great point. Right, that was an incredible discussion, lengthy but incredible. You ladies just kept saying so many great things. I was like, oh, we just have to keep going. So thank you so much. That was phenomenal. I want to let everybody know that's listening that the next book that we're going to discuss is The Fellowship of the Ring, the first book in the Lord of the Rings series. We're going to talk about the ring as a symbol of evil and the context around that. We're going to talk about finding principles in novels, about the hero cycle, and some other cool stuff. So pick that up. Have a great time reading it over the holidays. We'll see you in the new year, probably February-ish time. We'll have a discussion out for you. If you would like to engage in conversation, please go ahead and comment and send us your feedback. We'd love to hear from you on these books that we discuss. We hope that you pick up The Air to Breathe, that you have a great experience with it, and that it's helpful to you in understanding the world around you and why we are where we are, and maybe some tools for how to begin fixing it. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.